Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Peter Nixon. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Jules. Great to be with you.
Peter, where are you from and how did you find yourself in Hong Kong?
I'm actually Canadian. I'm from the French part of Canada, from the city of Montreal. And I graduated into a recession in the 80s and decided the only jobs were for the professionals. I turned down the family opportunity to become a doctor because that obviously wasn't for me, and I became an accountant. And I wanted to gain international experience. I became an auditor with one of the big firms, traveled to Switzerland first, and then transferred to Hong Kong. In 1989, I actually signed my contract a week before Tiananmen Square, and then landed here in October 89 after the wall had come down in Europe. And the rest is history, as they say.
And now a restructuring and change management consultant. What kind of things do you do in this role and how did you decide to move from accountancy into change management?
In the early 90s, about 5 years after I arrived in Hong Kong, I actually turned down the offer of partnership in the big firm because I had a passion for negotiation. And my passion for negotiation actually was because all the change we were seeing in the world, I found what really interested me was change management. And the part of managing change that interested me the most was managing the people. And the hardest thing about managing the people was, I thought at the time, negotiating them to get them to do what you wanted them to do, or as I subsequently found out, having a dialogue to find out maybe what you wanted them to do isn't what should be done, and the solution is in the dialogue.
And how did you get into this line of work? Like, how did you move into change management and restructuring? Did you have to kind of have mentors? Did you have to do any training? Did you join a firm or start your own company?
Well, all of the above, really. The passion for negotiation, I guess, arose from my upbringing in Montreal during the time that Quebec was trying to separate from Canada. And I watched the national leaders negotiate and keep that province in the country and work things forward while still protecting the distinct language and culture of the French in the Sea of English in North America. So when I transferred to Geneva, I had a particular interest to learn all about the United Nations. And I ended up joining their ski club. And on the weekends, we'd go skiing with all the diplomats. And I asked them about negotiation. And they said, oh, you just got to train. We take courses. That's how you learn to be a diplomat. I said, can I take those courses? They said, no, you're not a diplomat. You can't do that. and then I transferred to Hong Kong, and I thought, oh my God, negotiation is so much harder in Asia. And people say often the best negotiators are here in different parts of Asia. Some will point to the Chinese in Hong Kong, some will point to Shanghainese, some will talk about the Koreans or the Japanese, but they would never talk about people from Canada as being great negotiators. Maybe nice people and good diplomats, but not necessarily great negotiators. I set about in Hong Kong trying to figure out where can I take the courses that I wanted to take in Switzerland. And the leading provider at the time in Hong Kong was a group out of Australia. And so I took their courses, and then I became friends with the company owners, and then I started to work with them as well as doing my own stuff. And then I decided to leave them and try to go full time, because in Hong Kong, everyone tries to be an entrepreneur. So I thought, I'll just give it a try. I wanted to stay and watch 1997 handover, and things were going well. I was starting a young family. I started a business. I wasn't doing exclusively negotiation because I had agreed to a non-compete clause. Instead, what I was doing a lot of was facilitating group meetings related to these multinationals that were all coming to Hong Kong to grow their Asian footprint. And that taught me a lot about dialogue, exclusive from negotiation. I differentiate the two. Dialogue, I would say, is when you get the stakeholders to talk about the issues in the right way, in the right time, in the right place. But negotiation is really the more formal making and taking of concessions to work out an agreement.
Just before we get on to dialogue and your book, can you tell me a little bit about what sort of negotiations were you doing? Like, I'm imagining you in hostage negotiations and things like that. But I think it's more corporate. Is that right?
We definitely started corporate and started mostly on the sales negotiation front. Because again, with my background in the big accounting firms, we have clients that didn't want to pay our fees, so you had to negotiate fees. And then they didn't want to change their financial statements. You had to negotiate with them on financial statement disclosure. And then you had to negotiate on the letters that we write to make recommendations on internal control changes. And that's where I started. And then the market said, oh, this is useful. Can we use you for negotiating regulations? The people who make regulations to control, for example, the stock market, they think the regulations are black and white. So they thought, we've written the rules, why don't they follow them? And then I would work with the people on the other side of the table, and they'd say, these people making all these rules are crazy. How can we break them without being considered illegal? It's not black and white. The world is not black and white. There's a gray. So the more I gained experience, the more I was getting requests. And in time, the requests started then to come out of the public sector as well, because government actually faced some of the hardest problems. They're trying to solve climate change with manufacturers and industrial units who don't want to worry about paying the costs of protecting the environment. Or we have developers who are moving into historic areas. And so we have conservationists who want to protect the historical value of property or protect the environment. And then we have developers who just want to get rich and make money. And consumers who want to buy the best flats in the most beautiful places. The need for negotiation skills just grew as I learned more about it. I did get invited into more and more places, including getting invited to be interviewed and work with the hostage negotiation squad.
You did? Oh, see, I knew it. Oh my God, I'm psychic. What sort of things did you work on that were like hairy, scary, like negotiations with hostages?
Well, the hostage stuff is done in Hong Kong by the Hong Kong police. And the best negotiators, they're all actually in the police, because the tactical solutions are just an edge away from the dialogue. But what I learned working with them was the importance of everybody feeding the master negotiator all the information that he or she needs to conduct the conversation with the hostage taker.
You've learnt these skills, but you haven't actually been involved in a hostage situation.
I've been on site, but not involved in an actual hostage negotiation.
Oh, wow. That's exciting.
But worked with the guys who did. And
Wow. Yeah.
nice to hear their stories. I would say one of the bigger, tougher situations, I had to get involved in the people that were managing the Malaysian airline planes that were shot out of the air and disappeared off the radar. I was consulted by a senior advisor to the Ayatollah of Iran on their negotiations with the USA. So they're all, you find yourselves in these situations thinking, you pinch yourself and you say, why me?
Yeah.
But then you realize, well, someone's got to do it.
That's amazing. You've sort of traveled all over the world and done a whole lot of different things, haven't you, in this area?
I have 60 countries, maybe 600 different organizations, public sector, private sector.
Wow. Congratulations. You're amazing. That's incredible.
Well, it's cool. It's fun. But I've learned a lot also along the way, and I try to put that in my books.
You wrote a book about negotiation. Can you remind me the title?
Yeah, the negotiation book is called Negotiation Mastering Business in Asia. And the publisher, Wiley, who's great to work with, published my dialogue book as well. They wanted a book specific about Asia. And I said, yeah, but my negotiations in the Middle East or Europe, it's the same everywhere. And they said, yeah, but our audience is Asia, so you got to talk about Asia. The first part of the book is what's specific about Asia. And I talk about common threads like the importance of family, and the network makes all the difference. Most businesses are family owned, even if they're listed on the stock exchange. You've got to understand how to work the dynamics of the family if you're trying to work with them. Plus, relationships far outweigh the importance of the business. So they'll do business with loyal suppliers over generations. And just because you're the new kid on the block doesn't mean, even if you have better service and better product and better price, they're not necessarily going to work with you because you don't have those relationships. So there's stuff specific, I would say specific to Asia, but it's pretty common everywhere in the world except maybe North America and maybe Europe.
You did mention earlier that negotiations were different in Asia. I was wondering if that has to do with the cultural issue of faith. Is that a part of it?
Yeah, that's important. Often quoted by Westerners, the idea of saving face. I also learned the importance of giving face, but in any culture to show disrespect. That idea of respect is important. I think also in emerging economies, leaders don't really know everything. Maybe that's true everywhere in the world.
Yeah,
but
some more than others.
I've come to realize when I haven't just traveled to these countries. When I get to those countries, they close the door and they have a private conversation with me. And so I've come to realize it doesn't matter where you are in the world. Everybody's feels kind of exposed in some way for what they don't know, either in terms of the market or they don't know how to do in terms of skills, or they're really worried that their company or their product or service is threatened by what's happening overseas. And so I'm often called into situations just to share that experience. I'm like their eyes and ears on the ground.
Sounds super interesting. It sounds almost like you could be a star of a film. It's very cool. Peter, tell me about your book, Dialogue Gap. How did this come about? And tell me a bit about the importance of dialogue.
In my negotiation work, I found a declining ability to bring people to the table to discuss the problems and work out a solution. It used to be easy. The hard part in the old days was get them together. But once they got together, they could talk it out. They might yell and shout, throw things at each other, but they eventually would work it out. Nowadays, and I saw that over the increasing use of digital technology, I found a declining willingness, ability, and even desire to come to the table and talk things out. Even to the point where I started to ask clients, have you ever thought of just picking up the phone and calling them? And they said, no, why would you do that? Caused by our increasing use of digital communication, our ability to actually look people in the eye and work things out was diminishing. I coined the term dialogue gap. Everyone seemed to agree with it. And I predicted increasing conflict. And now we're in a world full of conflict. I think part of that is, I think you can draw a direct line back to leaders who themselves are not proponents of dialogue. We're in a tricky world. There's no question about the problems we're facing now are unprecedented. But still, the solution is you got to get the stakeholders together. You got to talk about the issues because it's the fastest way to work things out. Even though there's a lot of volatility and things change fast, you have your dialogue, you work it out today. If you have to meet again next month and change, to get them back in the room, get on Zoom, talk about it, and work it out. That's what's needed. But unfortunately, we have leaders who are less and less willing to dialogue with people of opposing views. And one of the things I like to stress is in schools, we've got to start teaching the emerging leaders how to do this because our environment needs it, our world needs it. Building faster missiles is not the solution.
Yeah. And I think at the moment, everybody is sort of moved really towards emails and texts and messages. And like you say, nobody is talking face to face. What do you think makes a good leader? What are some of the characteristics that people need to be a good leader?
It's a big question. Obviously, they need the specific technical skills in the area that they're working on, because if you're leading people to do the work, I think it helps if you know how to do the work yourself, or at least you've done it, have some understanding of how it's done. So that's one thing. But I think the interpersonal skills, really key. And there I would obviously point to the ability to bring people together, talk about the issues, understand the issues, understand the implications of the issues, and take a decision, an optimal decision. So decision making related to the ability to inspire and motivate people to come together and talk, especially when they're afraid to talk or fear the implications of talking. The selflessness of leaders is another aspect that's underplayed nowadays, because everyone seems to have an agenda of getting rich or getting higher up in the organization rather than helping develop the people below them, because we're only in these positions of leadership for a short time. One thing I was taught years ago was the job of a leader is just to develop other leaders.
Yeah.
That seems to be very true. The best organizations I've worked with, that's what they do. They place a lot of emphasis on developing the next generation of leaders.
Yeah, I think that selflessness is really, really important. And we're seeing some leaders around the world that seem very narcissistic rather than selfless. And I think that could be a big part of the problem. I think that also coming back to the issue of dialogue, a lot of people aren't having that dialogue and they're not using negotiation skills. And it just seems like things seem to be going very wrong all over the place, particularly with the pandemic and the way that it's being dealt with in some of the countries as well. Overall, why is communication so important? And how do you think communication has changed over the years? And are we losing these skills?
Well, I think we're losing the skill of dialogue. At the same time, we are better communicating. So let me differentiate the two terms. I define communication as whenever we're sending messages back and forth. We don't really know if the message is received. You might get a little plus sign on your message if it's technically received. But actually what you send, you know what you send, you don't know what has gone into their head. But that's communication. And I think we're communicating more than at any time in human history. And we're good at that. The problem is many situations of importance don't need communication, they need dialogue. And dialogue is when you think together. Historically, you'd sit in a circle in your cave and you'd say, there's a dinosaur outside of that cave, what are we going to do about it? Nowadays, we sit kind of theoretically on a circle on Zoom and we talk about the issues and we try to work out a way forward, which means you've got to express yourself, you have to listen deeply, you have to be present to the feelings and the attitudes of the people in the conversation, you have to respect each other, and you have to kind of suspend your assumptions that you think you know the answer. Because out of this circle will derive a solution. I even believe actually the solution's already there. And our job as leaders is to create the environment in which it reveals itself to us.
That's so true. I think that modern technology has definitely changed the way that we communicate. Do you think it's impacted the effectiveness of the dialogue and the communications?
Well, definitely we're communicating better. I love the technology. I'm a heavy user of all of the above technologies. But at the same time, I think we should recognize that our ability to dialogue is diminished, and we need to place more emphasis on that. And I think we should be training future leaders in school on how to do that. I'm not convinced that they learn how to do that at home. If you grow up in a home that's characterized by great dialogue, even difficult dialogue should be talked around the family table, right? But if they're not, I think it's fair to say a lot of kids nowadays are not growing up in that environment. They don't learn it at home. If they don't learn it at school, they end up in the workforce. And when things happen, they'll look to their leaders. And if the leaders themselves aren't creating space, showing respect, suspending their assumptions, being present, actively listening, and diplomatically expressing themselves, they'll never learn. We end up with more conflict and what I like to call suboptimal outcomes. You might get an agreement, you might get a yes, but you very often don't get the best decision, which is a problem. Especially just look at environment. Not only are we having some debate about the environment, it's quite clear the environment is not as good as it could be, and we're all suffering. You mentioned pandemic is another great example.
And we're all stuck at home. We're all separate. Everybody's separated, and now we're all communicating on Zoom rather than face-to-face.
Yeah, so it's affecting us personally. It affects families. It affects schools. It affects international trade and relations. But we also have this very interesting measurement of the curve. We can actually measure how countries are doing responding to the specific problem of COVID-19 cases and their spread and the number of people it ends up killing in hospitals.
You mentioned some of the tactics that you recommend people use just before when they're in dialogue and when they're trying to create the best outcome possible or find a solution. Do you have any other key tactics that people should use to have successful dialogue?
Number one tactic I would say for dialogue is to ask questions. I like to call it the mama technique.
That's cool.
Stands for mirror what they've said or mirror the emotions that they're expressing. And sometimes it might be silence. And then ask a question. And whatever they respond, mirror again and ask a question. I actually suggest that you do it at least 5 times. Mirror what they've said, ask questions. So you're going deeper and deeper on their conversation.
When you're saying mirror what they've said, you're repeating back to them in a different way what they've said. Is that right?
It can be, or as just to clarify. You're not going further on your topics. You're spending some time on what they have just said or what they've just expressed. You've mirrored by clarifying, what do I mean?
Okay, great. Oh, see, look, I've got some skills.
And then to ask a question to go deeper on that subject before jumping to the next topic.
Going to ask you then about active listening skills and whether that's an important part of dialogue. And what does it mean to be an active listener?
You probably know the skill of active listening is to be engaged with the speaker and to be responding to what they're saying. I think the mama technique could be considered an active listening approach. I like to tell the story of why I call it the mama technique. It's because imagine the 5-year-old child is outside playing, cuts his knee, and comes running into the house to see mom. And mom is a hardworking mom, and she puts her laptop aside, focuses entirely on the child, mirrors the child's upset, and asks what happened. And the child explains that they were running around the park and fell and he cut his leg and he's going to die because he's bleeding. And then she mirrors the angst of the child and then asks, how about I clean it? How about I put on a Band-Aid? And suddenly through this process of mirroring the child's responses and asking questions, she's resolving the conflict. She's understanding what happened and moving things forward. A couple of really important things have happened. First of all, the child ran in and she put her laptop aside and focused 100% on the child. Secondly, it wasn't her agenda at all. She was just asking questions about what did the child do? How did the child feel? What happened? Mirror, ask, mirror, ask. That's a common motherly approach. Fathers are not always that way, and it's not a gender thing. So sometimes fathers are very good at doing mama and mothers aren't, and vice versa. But I like to call it the mama approach because it stands for mirror, ask, mirror, ask. Then people sometimes say, well, what about the papa approach? And,
yeah,
and then
yeah. What's your acronym for that?
and then child runs in and mom's away at work and father's working from home. And what's the father's response? Papa says, you crazy boy, I told you don't run around the park. It's your fault. So it's like punish, accuse, and punish, accuse is the papa approach.
Great. There you go. That's brilliant.
But really at the heart of it, dialogue requires to ask questions and put your needs aside, focus on the other party, mirror where they're coming from, what they're saying, what their emotions are, what their silence is, and then ask a question about it and go deeper and deeper and deeper. If you go 5 levels down, almost like a Matryoshka doll, these Russian dolls, you get open it up.
Yeah, I used to have them as a baby, yeah.
Right? And then you get to the middle and you really understand what's going on.
Using that dialogue to achieve an optimal outcome, what are the elements of achieving an optimal outcome?
Well, the optimal outcome that I talk about is actually based on Nobel Prize winning economics. It was John Nash, in the movie A Beautiful Mind, that Ron Howard film. And Professor Nash was the man who discovered that Adam Smith's approach to markets, which we still follow today, in which the United States is the truest, the Republican Party, the truest proponent, is what's best for me is what's best for the markets. And John Nash said, that's not quite right. What's best for the markets is not what's best for you, but what's best for you and the other party. We basically prove that you need to sit down, as I like to call it, sit down and dialogue with the stakeholders to identify the issues and figure out the best way forward. The optimal outcome is mathematically, it's called the equilibrium point. But basically, it's the point at which no single party can get more without somebody else losing something. And it's based on the stakeholders getting together to talk about the issues in the best possible way to achieve the best possible decision at that point in time. And that's important, right? If you take an approach where you want to make America great again, it's a failed approach. It's proven, regardless of whether it's done well or done poorly, in the world today, we are so interconnected, we have to work on this together. So you can't fix international trade, for example, by only fixing one country. You need to figure it out together. Students in a class can't decide the best way to teach the class. You've got to include the teacher. And you have to include the other classes in the year group and the specialist teachers. I mean, there's a lot of stakeholders and the parents and. It's so important. It really applies to everything we do at work, at home, and in society. So that's kind of where I get my passion, because I keep seeing that we come up with these suboptimal outcomes. And I have compassion because I just say, well, the leaders don't know how to get there. They end up in conflict, and then we all lose. How can we help the leaders?
Exactly. And I guess that's what you're doing. And you've been traveling around the world a lot. I know we talked about you're traveling to do negotiation work, but now are you working more with dialogue and traveling around and talking to businesses about how they can bridge the dialogue gap?
It's really all integrated. Even though there's 4 books, it's all really one story. And my negotiation model, I call it the Star Negotiator. Somebody who is good at dialogue. They understand how to use tactics. They understand how to manage the information, work with different people, and they're effective in different scenarios. And some scenarios require more on dialogue. Some require more on conflict resolution, mediation. Some struggle with the information. Some people don't have tactics. Some people say, everything's fine, I just can't work with so-and-so.
You're there to work with them for whatever they need in any area.
But generally speaking, the public sector, when I've worked with governments, they always thought they had difficult dialogues. They didn't think they were negotiating, whereas private sector generally think they're negotiating because
Oh,
private sector just want to get a good deal. They don't necessarily want to get a good deal for everybody. They want the best deal for themselves. And that's understandable.
whereas governments want to try and get the best deal for the collective.
Governments have to worry about everybody. And I think that's what makes their job so difficult. Plus, governments are often way under-resourced compared to our private sector. Private sector have lots of money. They can hire all the best consultants from around the world, have the latest technology. Governments, if you walk into some government offices around the world, they're still using stuff from the 1950s. Japan has just announced they've updated from fax to email to manage COVID-19.
Oh my God, are you joking? Wow. Oh my God. Well, I got pickpocketed in Mongolia and had to go to the police station, and I couldn't believe it. It was like I was in the 1950s, all these big Dell computers and all these big like KG Russian safes along the side of the wall. And it was just like, it was the weirdest. It was honestly like I was in a 1950s cop show. It was so bizarre. And I was just like, wow, you forget, especially when we're in Hong Kong, when we have access to all this technology and high-speed broadband and all of that, we forget that that's not happening all around the world.
Yeah, that's a cool story of Mongolia. Because, all parts of the world are trying to catch up, but not all parts of the world are at the same place. I've also found that just having compassion for the leaders, they're all trying to do their best with what they're given and the time they're given and the resources they're given. One way I've changed in my career, when I was young whippersnapper working for the biggest firm in the world, we would walk into any of the big companies and we would find their mistakes and we'd hold them up in their face and say, you got to fix it. To some respects, that is the job of an auditor in the big firms, because that's what the shareholders and the markets want of the auditors. But I have subsequently learned that that doesn't achieve the best outcome. The best outcome actually is to have compassion for the people who are doing their best. I have seen some corruption, but largely, I would say 99% of the time, the leaders are not corrupt. They're just doing their best. And if they're making mistakes, they just don't want to get fired because they have to pay for their families. Stepping forward with a mindset of dialogue and compassion is far more effective than coming in with big weapons and like a police trooper,
all guns blazing,
trying to solve the world's problems.
I think, look, that's a really, really great message for us to take away. That resonates with me as well, especially just within leadership in any company. People are just trying to do their best. And look at what's happening at the moment with protests and pandemic and all of that. People have to really readjust their tack and change the way that they're doing things. And they've got to do it quickly and effectively and efficiently. And people can only do their best. Have you found that you've been in more demand in this situation when people have had to get online and make changes? Have you been busier?
No, I'm less busy, not because of the medium, but because of the recession. So
Yes.
The private sector has rolled up the carpet and they're hiding in their rabbit hole at the moment for obvious reasons.
That makes sense.
But it's been a very creative time. And
Yes. People have to think outside the box and reassess how they're doing things.
life is giving us a year or two to slow down and come up with new solutions. Because what's going to happen in the world post-pandemic has got to be very different than how we behaved that got us into this problem.
Yeah. Do you have a prediction?
Well, I'm a generally optimistic guy, so I believe that we'll work our way forward. I think we'll solve this with vaccines and we'll get those spread. And then the economy will slowly pick up again and we'll be a lot more respectful of our environment. If one message came out of COVID-19 is that if one person is sick somewhere, everyone is sick everywhere. And so it's great to think you're okay wherever you are in your part of the world. But if somebody is not okay in the poorest part of the world, we need to worry about that. And I think the fact that everyone is threatened by this for the first time in history, even the Spanish flu, there was a lot of safe spots in the world. But now there's nowhere safe. On the flip side of that is everyone understands we need to behave differently going forward. So I think that's a positive.
I think so. I think that's very, very wise words. When we're talking about the issues that you're talking about with businesses and government and how they're quite different. Is there also a universal theme amongst them with the work that you do, or is it really quite separate what you do with businesses and governments?
No, it's always the same. I come back to the optimal outcome. And I define that as a jewel. I actually use the icon of a diamond because everybody wants to get the best outcome. You know, families want harmony, couples want happy relationships.
Single people want love.
Everyone wants love. And, you know, I've sat with billionaires who want to make another billion. I've sat with royalty who want to keep their castle. You know, it's just the icon is important because it's the same approach, whether you're trying to solve environmental issues, make $1 billion. You have to bring the stakeholders together to talk about the issues in the right way, the right time, and the right space.
How can leaders effectively engage people in the decision-making process, and why is it important? Why is it important to get everybody on board and everyone to understand the importance of dialogue to reach this optimal solution?
So that's a good multiple question.
Sorry, could you focus? Luckily, you're skilled in listening. Do you want me to repeat it?
Well, first, leaders should invite people to contribute their ideas. There is no organization today where the boss can have all the answers. Things are changing so fast. The people who really know what's going on are the ones on the front line. You want to know what's going on, get out of your office and go walk around. It's just so important. Leaders need to invite input from all the stakeholders. And some leaders tell me, why should I waste my time? We know what the issues are and we know the decisions we have to take. And my point is, well, first of all, maybe you don't know everything. You might be surprised. Very often, a really innovative idea comes out of the front line that nobody in the high office of management would have thought about because they just don't have the same problems. Secondly, if you invite everybody to contribute their ideas, they love that. They all want to contribute. If they're being told their opinions don't matter, they will invest their time and energy elsewhere, which is exactly what they do in all sorts of organizations. I would say a third reason is we're developing tomorrow's leaders. Help them contribute their ideas, have a dialogue so they can also understand maybe they don't understand all the issues, and so their ideas and their solutions are valid, but their thinking is not complete. You can complete their thinking, and then you'll help them become better leaders as they grow up to new positions. I think that's quite important. Just ask. I think you need to ask because you can't have all the solutions. And then I forgot your third part of the question.
You're fired. No, you covered it. And just why is it important? And I think you've covered that because you're building the leaders of the future and you want everybody to be invested in the common goal. You've covered the whole question very well.
Examples are always good. And I remain involved in school leadership and school management because I think that's an area where I can help and I have some experience. Every time I try to stop helping, they keep saying, "We don't stop, we need your help." And this pandemic is a big issue because parents are struggling doing online learning with their kids at home. They're struggling already in their jobs, working from home. And some have lost their jobs or had their income cut. So they're stressed. They're stressed with their family members. The situation is far from ideal. We have some kids that are learning faster online, and we have some who are not learning anything online. You take a particular year group, you're going to have that spread from best to worst in terms of understanding the content is getting a lot wider and a lot harder to manage as they move up in the school. But I keep saying we should talk to the parents. Got to talk to the parents, to talk to the kids, talk to everybody, figure out what's going on. This is in times of rapid change and unstable situations like we find ourselves in, we need more dialogue. So it's not business as usual. We should be doing a lot more dialogue. And one very cool idea has just come up. One parent said to me, they're really disappointed that the schools are not reopening in Hong Kong. We have to do online learning again because we've had the kids at home all during the vacation and now they're still here and it's awful. Yeah. They said, can we use the classroom to work from home? Because we can't work at home. The kids are here, the partners are here, There's no peace here. I need a place to go and work. And I said, well, it's a brilliant idea. Let's investigate. I don't know if it would work. I don't know if it's allowed to work. But we have schools full of empty classrooms, and we're telling parents they have to work from home. And in Hong Kong, the homes are quite small. So why not make the classrooms available for work from home? It's a great idea. You know, you don't come up with these types of ideas in the ivory tower. You come up with these ideas talking to the people on the ground who are suffering through the problems.
That's a great example, and it would work really well. I guess we're restricted by the social distancing rules that we have at the moment, but they could shift and change before we get back to school. But yeah, it makes sense. You've got to hear what different people want and what they need and what they'd like and what would work best from them. And then you try and come up with solutions. That's very cool.
You asked about, are the companies busier online? At the moment, they're not. We expect that's going to rapidly change. We're already starting to notice now after several months, it is starting to change as companies start to realize the new normal is right here online. But what has changed is consultants like myself. We're incredibly networked. We're working together. We're working with different content providers, coming up with new solutions, new ways of reaching out to our clients once the clients are ready to start buying again. And that's very cool because the market has basically crashed for all in-person events, all corporate training, no events, no facilitation, no meetings, except online. The ability and the need to come up with innovative solutions has grown dramatically. That's why I'm very optimistic. There's a lot of cool stuff happening that's now emerging.
I can see that we'll probably end up with our parent-teacher interviews still on Zoom, even when things go back, will change, because they were so effective and parents loved it and they could just do it while they're at work and then get back to work. And it was all so efficient. So I wouldn't be surprised if we continue. Some good practices will be taken out of what we've had to adapt to during the pandemic, which is quite interesting.
I love it. Hybrid is the new normal.
Oh, I like that. The hybrid is the new normal. I love that. I was watching your TED Talk, which was amazing. Can you just tell me again what it's called for our listeners if they'd like to check it out?
What's it called?
Can you remember? Oh, don't worry. I'll put it in the show notes. For my listeners out there, I'll put it in the show notes. But it was great.
The TED Talk is recorded at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. It was done a few years ago. Every time I look for it, because people ask sometimes for the link, I just type in TED Peter Nixon and it appears.
It'll come up. Okay, perfect.
That's why I don't know the title.
Yeah. That's okay. I'll put it in the show notes anyway.
The background for it was interesting. It was business students at Hong Kong UST who reached out because they wanted a speaker on negotiation. And lovely Indian girl at UST was in charge of finding a speaker. And I said, so why do you want somebody on negotiation? And they said, it was our favorite course in MBA. We've already taken the course, and the prof, we all know the prof, we all took the course. So we need somebody else, someone different, because he'll just tell us stuff we've already heard before. They reached out to me. It was a very, very fun experience, very different than anything I'd done before. Stand on the red dot, deliver exactly the message you want. It'll be there forever.
You did a great job.
I'm more or less happy with the way it worked.
It's really interesting. You talked about talent management. What is talent management and why is it important?
As you probably know, the terminology changes over the years from people management, talent management, HR management, leadership and development. That's all.
Okay, so it's all similar.
But, managing your talent, I think today the contract has changed. People don't work necessarily for the boss. They work on a project. They may be an employee. They may be a subcontractor. They may be somebody in a supply chain. And you're given, first, you've got a project. Some projects last a year, some last several years, but pretty much all work we do nowadays is a project because if it's routine, it's been taken over by computers. You look at your project and say, okay, what talents do we need on this project? We may need financial skills. We may need geographic skills and building engineering skills and interpersonal skills. Then you decide, okay, who can we get to fill those roles? And the leading companies nowadays are really open as to whether those people are employees or contractors. And I've worked with some They don't even know. They don't care. Do you work for us? For example, Marriott, considered repeatedly one of the best organizations in the world to work for. They think I'm an employee. I'm around a lot. I'm not an employee, right? Somebody who's an employee nowadays might get less salary and more comps and benefits. And somebody who's a contractor might get no comps and benefits and higher daily wage. The talent management part of it has really changed. I was invited last June to KL to receive a talent management award for my efforts trying to contribute to talent management over a lifetime of doing this in Asia.
Oh, congratulations.
Which I really appreciate it because it was recognition that even though the needs of the markets change over time, as long as you're constantly trying to help, that's what we all need, right? I need that. You need that. We all need that. How can we stay abreast of what's needed in order to stay relevant? And, I'm in my late 50s now, and I see people my age who've basically given up. And I think, wow, you could contribute for another 20 years. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Why are you just giving up? And I don't think it benefited as much by talent management or talent development. They've been used up and churned out and thrown away by the system. And you can blame your employer, you can blame your company. You might have fallen on bad luck, but we have a big responsibility to keep training ourselves, keep reading, keep learning. That's why earlier in the conversation, the last 6 months for me have been a very steep learning curve. How to use all this technology and how, not just the hardware, how do all the softwares talk to each other to produce the best possible podcasts or video blog or YouTube video? It's complicated stuff. It's not impossible. We can learn. And if you like a challenge, you can study it.
Yeah.
Reach out to other people because they're all on this same journey.
That's exactly right. I taught myself how to podcast by doing a 21-hour course on Udemy that cost me about $7 Australian, and then learning how to edit on YouTube.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And now you've done what?
And I did that in my 50s. I started in my 50s. That was pretty cool.
I think it's important to have examples of people, regardless of age, who just keep wanting to learn and do stuff. And
yeah, I
that's
think so.
What inspired me. My mentors, when I switched to do what I do now, were already in their 60s. Now they're in their 80s, and they're still writing books and still consulting. And
that's so cool.
A little slower, but
it's not all over at 60 or 65.
Be in the game.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing that's needed, I think, now more than ever is this, especially in this pandemic, is perspective. And with age comes some resilience.
And wisdom, we would hope.
And so I think that we need that. We need people to give that back.
Definitely.
People nowadays are worried for all the right reasons.
Absolutely, I agree. Peter, do you think we need to think about cultural differences when we're communicating with others? And if so, how can we do that?
Yeah, culture is important. Before the pandemic, I would say the best way to learn cultures is to travel. And now we can't travel. And I don't think travel is going to come back anytime soon. But we live in diverse cities. And if you really want to learn about culture, you can just turn to people from different cultures and ask them simple questions. Somebody from your culture, what are the issues that are important for you on this topic? I'll give a practical example. I was invited to do work in Bahamas. One thing I knew about the Caribbean was that every island considers their culture different than the island next to them. For foreigners who don't know the Caribbean, they figure it's all the same. But so I flew into Bahamas, and I do this everywhere I've gone in the world. I go early and I stay extra days at the end in order to talk to the people, understand the issues, travel, go to some important cultural sites. So I flew in early. You fly in early for a Monday meeting. I arrived on Saturday instead of arriving on Sunday. And on Sunday, everyone goes to church. So I went to church in Nassau. I didn't quite understand the church. I just went to one that was near the hotel. And I show up at the door, and really tall elder is at the door. He's about 6'9". And he says, "Oh, you're new here." And I introduce myself and extend my hand and say, "Yeah, I'm Peter. I'm here for the week. I just thought it'd be fun to come to church." And he welcomes me in. And I realized I'm the only white guy in the church.
That's happened to me in South Africa. It was cool. They treated me like royalty.
And so friendly, invited me to their homes for lunch afterwards, gave me a little tour of the island. And turns out that the elder at the door is the most famous basketball player from the island. And everyone at work on Monday was shocked that I actually knew him.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
Just throwing yourself into those situations is really the best way to do it. But if you can't do it by travel nowadays, talk to your neighbors. They're all from different realities.
Absolutely. And we do have the internet as well. So you can research as well. If you know you're going to be meeting with a certain cultural group, you can kind of do a bit of research about what's appropriate or inappropriate.
Yeah, that's also important. One thing I've learned, I've studied Buddhist philosophy for about 20 years. And I was put onto that after speaking to a women's group in Hong Kong. They gave me a book coupon so I could go to the bookstore. And I thought, well, I'll go to a different part of the bookstore for the first time in my life. And I see this book on negative emotions. And I thought, wow, negative emotions, that's really important in negotiation. So I buy the book, take it home, and it's all about Buddhist philosophy and 2,500 years of managing emotions. I got really intrigued and I studied it. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized a lot of people in Hong Kong, they behave and they do things for reasons of Confucian or Buddhist reasons without knowing that's where they started and that's where they come from. A Western example, we put our hands together to pray. And a lot of people have done that, whether they're religious or not. Sometimes they put their hands together to say namaste, or they put their hands together to just think, oh my God, I hope this works out. I hope I get promoted, right? But you ask people, why do you put your hands together? And people do it, and nobody knows why. So I found in my reading that just came from India thousands of years ago. People wanted to represent the lotus and the five-finger lotus coming together. I want for you to rise out of the mud and blossom like a beautiful lotus.
Oh, that's amazing.
Which is beautiful, right?
Yeah, that is beautiful. That's so cool. That's great.
But sometimes culturally, we don't even know our own culture or where it originated from. If you want to do change management, you have to really understand, where are these people coming from?
You would have a broad understanding of sort of cultural traditions and values and things like that over your years of work.
I do. I walked in pretty naive, no question about it.
Sure. And you'd learn a lot on the job as you go along, wouldn't you, as well?
But I think probably the most important thing I learned was I have to learn. There's a blind spot. I need to ask questions. I need to have eyes open and be aware. And so I'd recommend anyone who's trying to interact with people from a different culture, you just got to ask questions and look and be aware, because it's important. They're driven by stuff that, this Black Lives Matter movement right now. Very interesting for a lot of Caucasians like myself who felt there was never any issues. And then people are saying, well, that's the issue. If you weren't white, you'd understand that's the problem. But
I've just bought a couple of books.
There's a problem.
I know. I've just bought White Supremacy and another Black Lives Matter book. I can read up on it and learn more about it.
Another good one on the topic is called Biased, another bestseller at the moment.
Oh, okay. Peter, how important do you think diversity and inclusion policies are in business and government?
Oh, so important. I have done work in that area as well. I guess I'm considered an ally, but I'll tell you, I've worked with some organizations that walk the talk. They're open to diversity of all descriptions, and they have amazing talent. And they know that the talent exists in the diversity world more than in the normal world. and so they are hiring talent, they're selling to talent, they're earning innovation, doing really well. I've also worked in organizations that have hit the brick wall against diversity situations and been blatantly racist or homophobic, just being closed to ideas. There's all sorts of problems. They just fall short of an optimal outcome. As you know, I drive for optimal outcomes. And if they're not open to diversity of any description, color or size or shape, it prevents getting the best outcome. It's a dialogue, right? both sides have to dialogue. But if you exclude yourself to any talent, any people, you're not going to get the best outcome. On the gender issue of male, female representation in senior leadership, I fall on the side of our Canadian Prime Minister. He said it's 2020. Why wouldn't I have 50% women in the cabinet? And
good old Justin.
There's issues around that as well. And now there's a big push for Black and Indian representation in senior leadership because of Black Lives Matter. That'll inevitably lead to other issues. But I look in the mirror and I'm old, white male. And for some people, that means I'm going to kill them with a gun. So we're all living this reality.
Yeah.
We need to be open to diversity.
How can people suspend egos and assumptions and beliefs that they have about others? Do you have any advice on that? Because some people have these sort of negative beliefs and attitudes entrenched in their psyche. How can they make these changes?
Well, I think that's maybe your hardest question, right?
I left it till later, so you were comfortable.
I mean, so what do you think?
I think, that's very clever. Very good negotiation skills. Put it back on me. I think that people need to be better educated. I think they need to be challenged in a non-aggressive way about their assumptions. And perhaps, I think education. I really think education is the key. And I think the younger generation can educate the older generation and help them open up their eyes. Like, for example, my brother's gay, and when he came out, my mum freaked out, but now she's absolutely fine with it all because she became more open-minded and educated because she was willing to be, I guess. I guess you've got to get the willingness. I don't know. What do you think?
So it's true. I love your answer. That's good. And I just used a common tactic in negotiation.
Yeah, I know. I noticed.
When you're asked a good question, then you just throw the question back. Then you understand where the questioner is coming from. I came out of an environment of a lot of very fixed ideas about the world. That worked for those generations. Maybe it worked because they lived on their side of the hill with everyone who agreed with them. And on the other side of the hill, there was other people, but they didn't have to worry about them. And now we all live together. We have to figure out how to live together. And that means dialogue. That means openness. That means compassion for each other.
Kindness, is really important, isn't it?
How to understand where they're coming from is a dialogue. But I think for me, the number one approach and tactic is compassion. And so I flip it on the side. I was working with somebody in Singapore, and she needed help for an employee or a boss who was giving her endless bad times. She hated her, and she wanted a strategy to get her out of her life. And on one level, everything she told me about the boss, I totally understood and thought, maybe we should just plan a career move. And that's the change management that we should be talking about. But I gave her a task. I said, go home tonight and think about all the reasons why you think your boss is behaving the way she is. And then we'll talk about it in the morning. And she did it. And she went back home and she thought about maybe the boss is insecure. Maybe the boss doesn't have the skills for the new digital reality that she finds herself leading. Maybe she doesn't understand the young people she's supposed to be in charge of. Anyway, she came back to me the next day and she said that changed everything. By actually meditating on her boss and why her boss was behaving so negatively and where that behavior might be originating from, opened her eyes to why the boss was doing what the boss was doing and changed her whole opinion of the boss. She still didn't like the boss. She didn't agree with the boss, but suddenly she had compassion for the boss. And that changed everything because then she could start to work with the boss to help the boss move forward, to accept how, in this particular situation, artificial intelligence was changing everything in the company. And the boss was panicking because she knew nothing about it. What she really needed as a boss was people in the team who were going to work with her, not to expose her vulnerability, but to work with her and help her learn the implications. My client started to do that. Not only did the boss start to like her, she started to get recognized by the boss. And when the next round of promotions came along, she got the big promotion because she had shown the boss that not only did she know how all this stuff worked, but she was a team player willing to work with people in the team, regardless of skills and abilities. And I think that's the world we're in today. We need to work together.
That's a cool little story. I like that a lot. That really does summarize it. We do need to work together. We do need to have compassion and kindness. We do need to suspend judgment. And I think also the media and social media need to take more responsibility. I think they have a big influence over people. And I think that's something that we could use to make change as well.
Yeah, these echo chambers are tough. That's why I appreciate what you're doing in your podcast. Because you're talking to all sorts of people about all sorts of things and the solutions in the dialogue.
Exactly. And also the connection is in the dialogue, and the inspiration is in the dialogue, and the learning is in the dialogue, and the solution is in the dialogue. I love that you use that quote at the end of your TED talk. It's great, but it really is relevant to all interactions in life, not just businesses and governments.
My kids joke, they say they're going to put that on my tombstone.
Great. I think that's the title of I just got to write that down. The solution is in the dialogue is the title of the podcast.
On the back, they're going to say, he finally stopped talking.
That's brilliant. So tell me a little bit about your other 3 books. You've got The Dialogue Gap, and then what are the other 3?
First book was Negotiation, and a lot of people wonder how to get published. I got to be honest, I was just totally lucky. I wanted to share my negotiation experience, and it just so happened that Wiley, at that time, was looking to publish a book on negotiation. I wrote to them, and they said, wow, we were looking for someone just like you. So people who have something to say on a topic that people want to read about, and it's got some commercial value, you've got a book. Anyway, that was my first book, and then I explained how that evolved into Dialogue Gap. The third book is called The Business Developer's Playbook, and that arose because forever big clients were saying, we are completely surprised at how successful you've been operating on your own, and we'd like to know, how do you do it? And that then became a corporate training opportunity for me. I referred earlier to my trip to Nassau. That's actually what I was doing there. I was helping a bank improve their business development in private wealth management. The Business Developer's Playbook describes exactly how I built the business and what I do on a regular basis to plan, connect, dialogue, record, and follow up in terms of business development. But not just it's not selling. It's connecting with people to learn from each other, to share what you're doing, to make referrals, to ask for help. That's the heart of that book. When I wrote that book, I actually found the topic a little under-inspiring. So I thought I would snazz it up with a book on culture. And when I presented it to my publisher, they said, well, you've got 2 books here. Not 1 book, you've got 2 books. And they were right. I published the business development book separate, and I've just published the book on, I call them success hurdles or cultural hurdles. And I'll tell you about the title in a minute, but the book was written a few years ago when I identified 9 hurdles that seem to separate the best organizations from all the rest. Things like being sustainable and being trustees for the future, and dialogue is one of them. Being inspired and having faith that if you do all these right things, it's going to work, and knowing how to partner with people in different organizations. They're all the things that the great companies do. I made a book out of that, and I started to march it around to publishers, and then the pandemic hit, and I thought, wow, the world's completely different than before I wrote this book. I need to change it a bit. And I didn't change it very much. What I changed was some of the wording, obviously, that has to address the pandemic. But I added a 10th chapter. So there's 9 success hurdles or cultural hurdles. And the 10th chapter is what I describe as potentialism, which is what we talked about earlier. It's this diamond, the optimal outcome, that we have a duty to realize our potential while helping others realize theirs. And that's the central philosophy of my work. It always has been. And I'm bringing it forth because I think the world's a little bit stuffed.
It's not quite the title you used.
I followed other authors. Authors, first of all, they're self-publishing. Kindle direct publishing is skyrocketing. Traditional publishers are having a hard time. My first publisher turned down the book. I didn't offer it to my second publisher, and I thought, I'll just try to self-publish just for the learning experience, which has been a great experience. And something other authors are doing are polling their networks to ask for title ideas or suggested titles. I had 9 different titles around potential, potentialism, realizing your potential, culture, success hurdles, blah, blah, blah. And at the last minute, I thought, I'll just add one more because we're fucked. The world today is really screwed up. And I find that word still offensive. I was raised in a household that if we ever used that word, we'd have our mouth washed out with soap. But I also recognize last year, 3 of the top 10 best-selling books used the F word in their title, 2 of which I read and I loved. So I included on the list, and guess what gets voted? Number 1 was potential, and number 2 was the F word. And then very experienced authors all told me you need a 2-part title. 1 is the hook to capture attention, and 2 is the subtitle to explain to the reader what's it about. The book is called We're Fucked, with the U replaced by the exclamation mark, so it's not banned by all of the search engines. Yeah. And then the subtitle, which I forget at the moment, basically says that we need to realize our potential, otherwise we're all going to head into problems.
And has it sold well? Like, do you think the title has played into sales? Oh, it's hard to know, isn't it?
Well, it's in pre-release.
Oh, okay.
So I've also learned from the digital world nomads out there. They recommend divide it into chapters, publicize it on LinkedIn because it's a business book, 1 chapter a week, and grow interest, and then release it after the chapters have generated the interest.
That's a hot little tip.
It's all on Kindle for pre-release October 3rd, I think, or October 10th. Double 10s.
Great. Great. Yeah. 10th to 10th.
And I think the paperback is already available for purchase, part of my learning curve.
I think it is, because I looked you up on Amazon. I think it's there on Amazon.
There's a lot to learn, right?
Yeah, I self-published my book. I wrote a book, Fool Me Twice, on how I was scammed and assaulted in an online dating scam. And it's done really well. I turned it into a podcast with my daughter, which has done really well. We got nominated for a Webby for best writing.
Wow, really?
In the US.
Sorry to hear the story, but
that's okay. It was 10 years ago, and I'm helping others. It's fine.
I know others have been affected by it, so I'm glad that you're helping.
I just think that the self-publishing thing is a good way to go. But if you don't have a massive network or other books or a huge email or following or whatever, I think it's very hard to sell. I imagine that if you've got a publisher that they help you with sales, but maybe I'm wrong.
The traditional publishers have been great. They get you translated. They get you into online bookstores around the world. They get you into the bricks and mortar bookstores, the few that are left around the world. They have got me speaking gigs that have turned into international business travel.
That's brilliant.
They do support, but they're also struggling because people aren't buying. Business books traditionally sell in business airport bookstores. Airports are closed. People aren't flying, so they're not buying books. Big changes in the world. But my publisher right now is helping me figure out how to work with them to take their content online in Chinese, which is very cool.
Oh, wow. That's really cool, because there's a big business community up there, so that should really help.
I assume some of the listeners are thinking of self-publishing, so I would encourage you to do it. The big publishers actually like to take published books that seem very popular but are still circulating in small sales because of small footprint of the author. then they take them and they publish them and they take them to the bigger market. They also asked me if I know any business authors who I could recommend. They could just pick up the title, they buy the rights, and then they take you global. You only get there if you take that first step, right?
Absolutely. Peter, how can my listeners find you and your books if they'd like to get in touch with you or like to buy one of your books?
Oh, thank you for asking. The books are all on Amazon. The easiest thing to do is look for Peter Nixon on Amazon.com. They're also sold through other channels, depending on your favorite ones. You can find some of the other options as well as more about me on my website at potentialdialogue.com. There's links there to social media. I'm on LinkedIn and YouTube and WhatsApp and everywhere.
Cool. Awesome. So, Peter, thank you so much for chatting to me today. It's been so interesting. I've absolutely loved it. We've gone on for an hour and 20 minutes. Sorry to take up so much of your time, but it's been absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for coming on Hong Kong Confidential podcast.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and inviting me, and congratulations doing what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. For my listeners out there, if this is something that you've really enjoyed, please share it with your friends and family. And if you can go to iTunes to rate and review me, that would be fantastic. It will help me get up the charts, and it will help get Peter and his books and his negotiation skills and the importance of dialogue out to the rest of you. That would be fantastic. And if you would like to sponsor my podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Hong Kong Confidential. And for as little as $1 a month, you can hear Peter's answers to 4 secret questions that I'm going to ask him now. Peter, we're going to say goodbye here on the podcast, and I'm going to see you over in Patreon. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.